Yesterday, SET was played in the SPL for the first time, and for the second time on the same day too. Today, we'll talk about exactly that. Scream, the jungler for Splice, picked up SET in multiple games against PlayStation Gaming, the first and second game to be more precise, and well, it didn't quite go as successfully as some of you may have been hoping for based on your statements on SET, and for some of you may have been exactly what you expected, and for some of you it may have been something in between. We'll analyze this a little bit and we'll also pick apart the builds and the matchups here. So what did these games have in common? Well, first of all, both of these games were lost, while Splice won the other 3 games where there was no SET present. But I do not think that in this context that means that SET was the issue here. Splice played these games differently. For example, Aurora was also running Aegis in both of these games in order to have a more aggressive support playstyle and that kind of survive through the Aegis. So it wasn't necessarily just the SET pick that changed between those games. And furthermore, SET stats in both games were actually pretty good. In the first game, Scream went 3-0-2, not a single death to his name, and in the second game he went 7-4-10. Now there were of course other things that went wrong in these games that led to them not winning, but I don't think those were necessarily things that were tied to SET. But at the same time we have to keep in mind that Splice won the other 3 games. They got ahead in these games as well, and yet at some point lost the game. And I think what's interesting to look at in this context as well is the matchup. So in the first game, the team on Splice side was Amaterasu, Amazon Cub, Hercules, Freya and SET. That means you have an okay amount of setup between Amaterasu and Hercules, though not the best one, and a whole lot of damage. It means that the enemy team has to kind of split their damage between the carries or decide to focus on a single one, and in most situations that will not be SET. When you have massive damage coming out of Amazon Cub, Freya and SET, then SET is probably the one you're gonna go for the least in most situations because he's the one who has an easier time getting away with his teleport anyways. With Freya you can at least force her ultimate, and Amazon Cub has even less means of getting away except his movement speed. SET also would have had the option to just sit in the backline until Hercules gets a pull, though that was not the case in this game. On the enemy team, however, we had quite a few guards that actually facilitated SET's job. I would like to show clips of that here, but unfortunately Hi-Rez has messed up the whole SMITE VOD's YouTube channel, so I can't rewatch those because Mixer doesn't really work for me. But what I can tell you is that, for example, SET got a pretty decent pick on Merlin, who was simply out of options to get away from him, and that's just something that works for SET against a character like Merlin very well. Merlin is simply an easy to pick guard for SET. His biggest strength in terms of escaping is going over walls, and SET can just follow him through that. And if Merlin used 1 or 2 abilities in lane, then he probably doesn't have the potential to burst SET down, but SET very much has the potential to burst him down at any point. In addition to that, the other guards on the team were Jormungandr, Hunbatz, Athena and Jingwei. Hunbatz isn't ideal into SET either, in my opinion at least. SET is a guard that is very much countered by hard CC, because that is what can disrupt him in his ultimate, and Hunbatz only really has the way to do that through his own ultimate, so when that's down, SET can basically go in for free, and even when it's up, a Magi's Blessing or Beats or something can prevent that. And then Hunbatz is pretty much out of options because his damage potential is normally not as high as SET's. A guy with anti-heal like Sir Cat, for example, or a guy like Susanoo who can just quickly disrupt him is, in my opinion, a lot more trouble for SET than Hunbatz. And then we have Jormungandr, who technically has CC, but SET is just a guy that is typically built with so much mobility and has extra mobility through his ultimate that he can avoid Jormungandr's kit too easily. He can definitely get away from the 2 in most situations, and he can also juke the ultimate very easily, so he doesn't have to be too concerned with him either. Jingwei has some hard CC, but it's not necessarily the easiest one to confirm on a mobile guard like SET. He can teleport around the same time and he can move around very quickly, so she's also not exactly safe. And the only guard that really works against SET on this team, in my opinion, is Athena, because she has that taunt. As such, Scream had to primarily focus on avoiding Athena in order to be relatively free to do whatever he wants, and he did that with Magi's Cloak and with Purification Beads, so there was really not much of a way at all to stop him from doing his job. In Game 2, the matchup was a little bit different. The gods on Splice's team were Osiris, Aphrodite, Cabrakan, Freya, and Set. This team, in my opinion, is better for Set overall. Cabrakan just has this very clear, defined setup that can really put a single enemy into a place that Set can work with. Osiris can kind of keep enemies very busy to keep them away from the shackles or set up CC as well. Freya, again, as a damaging god that kind of draws the attention away from Set, is also very strong. And last but not least, Aphrodite, obviously. It's a very good god with a god like Set who kind of has the weak point of not having super high sustain outside of his ultimate and being kind of prone to being shut down while in the fray of the fight. And if you have an Aphrodite on you with healing and with her ultimate, then that's a whole lot easier. The enemy team wasn't as favorable for him this time though. We had King Arthur, who Set can't really do all too much against in most situations, but King Arthur just outsustains him and is able to tank his spawns even when there's a high number of them, so that's not exactly his primary target. And Arthur can also be relatively annoying to him. Despite his mobility, he can also take him out of the fight with his ult and set up for his team. Honbats, again, in my opinion, not the strongest pick, we talked about him. Then Jingwei and Athena we also addressed, but Habwa is also another god that should do relatively well against Set. It didn't work out so well for Endenstar on Habwa here because he just fell behind a little bit and he didn't really have the burst that he wanted to, and Scream kind of built against it as well. But in theory, it's still a threat and it still at least forces Set to build a certain way, because if he doesn't, then Habwa will just roll over him the moment Set teleports on him or gets close to him in any way with his ultimate. So that's very, very punishing for Set in many situations. Scream also had a very interesting playstyle with Set. Well, of course, in many situations in the game with Aphrodite just stuck to her, he was generally often on the outline of fights, just trying to get a little bit of poke in here and there, and it was very, very patient. He would not go in unless he was 100% sure he would get a kill and would be able to get out as well. And that's why much of the fight was actually spent either on the outskirts, or he was simply going for a 1v1 pick somewhere where he knew that no one else was going to get close in time. He also frequently disengaged once he went into a fight, knowing that he could risk losing the trade, so he was overall playing very carefully. In addition, he used his spawns to scout a lot and get a lot of vision that way, which especially helped on objectives or, for example, to get picks when people were backing under towers and similar. Another interesting point to note is that in neither of the games did he build Blink at all, which obviously falls on the build section here and transitions us over there, but it also affects his playstyle a lot because he didn't engage with blinks. He either engaged with his 3 or more often by just slowing the enemy with his 1 and then walking in and forcing their escapes and then using the 3 to follow up. But what did he actually build? In game 1, his build was as follows. Reinforced Greaves as the first finished item, then Stone-Cutting Sword, Blackthorn Hammer, Hydra's Lament, Magi's Cloak, and Bloodforge. I think this item build is extremely interesting. Now, the Reinforced Greaves can be explained by the Jormungandr and the Merlin and the Hunbats on the other team. They all have long ticking damage, so against that, Reinforced Greaves works very, very well. Stone-Cutting Sword seems to be a staple for Set, at least in Scream's eyes. He built this in both games, and I can kind of see it. I can see it as he doesn't really need Haste Katana to stick to enemies anyways, and it comes with a lot of physical power, and it comes with a little bit of extra movement speed from him as well, while having that protection reduction allowing him to not go into pen items. The issue that I see with Stone-Cutting Sword is being able to get close enough to even apply it, because every other poke damage you do outside of that is lower, but then again, his poke damage outside of a full engage isn't that high anyways unless you position very poorly. Blackthorn Hammer should be very self-explanatory. He just benefits from CDR, from being more survivable, being able to stay in the fight and that way apply his ultimate plus 3 better for more procs and more heals, and it just has everything he needs with the extra damage as well. Hydra's Lament is another one of those items that's very good on Set. I've talked about this in the past. Every spawn you spawn with your 2 gives you the extra proc, which especially helps during his ultimate as well. You also have the extra CDR, which is very helpful, and with a build like the one he was running, you are able to go in long enough to get a lot of benefit out of Hydra's Lament. The next item was Magi's Cloak, again very self-explanatory, with the CC on the enemy team being almost completely countered through it. And then last but not least, the Bloodforge, just for a high power spike at the end, and to be able to survive better after going in for a kill, which works very well for set 2. It's worth noting that while we get the flat protection reduction through Stonecutting Sword, there's no other flat pin in the build, and there is no percentage pen either, so he's really focused on taking down the tanks with a build like that. His build in the second game was actually fairly different. While he was still building Stonecutting Sword as his initial item, he built Hilary Boots here, simply because he didn't need to go into Reinforced Greaves as the enemy team didn't have nearly as much tick damage overall. He went into Ancile next, and that was because there was a Habois, so you can counter him very easily and stop him from using his 1 on you immediately or his ultimate when you hard engage on him, and that worked really well. And he also built a Brawler Speedstick simply to counter out the healing from King Arthur, as well as a Shifter's Shield, again a very interesting item because it allows him to hard engage with more damage, and then the moment he gets attacked by the enemies, he will be a bit more tanky and he has a better chance of getting out. And then, last but not least, he finished it off with a Magi's Cloak. Again, no Titan's Bane here, very much focused on targeting the squishies. He has a bit more flat pin this time with the Brawler Speedstick here, but overall still focused on a bruiser hybrid style with a fair bit of defense and a fair bit of damage and a little bit of health as well, so that he would be able to stay in the fight long enough to do his job, to apply all those stacks to enemies and survive and get out again. Ideally with a kill. I've tried this build style a little bit more today. I gotta say I like it, but it feels very different from a more damage oriented build, so it's something to get used to. I actually lost 2 out of 3 of the games, but then again I also had a new player in my first game and a DC in my second game, so maybe that's not the best judgment, but I overall felt like it was easier to at least perform on a decent level and not fall behind as hard when things weren't going exactly according to plan. I stand by my point that I think that set will need drastic tweaks that adjust him from overall being so ultra-reliant to have a bit more of a consistent kit overall, but the SPL games that we saw here don't really say much about him in either direction in my opinion, and we'll have to see more of him first. But at least we have some builds that we can toy around with, and that I think is a first interesting insight into set on a competitive level. I hope you found this interesting as well. And if you enjoyed this video, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell. See you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.